Every year, people spend billions trying to quiet inflammation with capsules, powders, protocols, and foods engineered in factories to look more ancient than they are. The labels sound precise: cellular defense, joint support, antioxidant complex. But the foods doing much of the real work were named in Scripture thousands of years before inflammation became a word on a wellness label. That is the part most people miss. When Deuteronomy describes the promised land, it does not speak in abstractions. It names wheat, barley vines, figs, pomegranates, olive oil, honey. Not categories, not decorations, specific foods. And when the spies returned from Canaan in numbers, they carried grapes, figs, and pomegranates as evidence of the land itself. Fruit became testimony. Today, we are walking through 15 biblical foods that modern research now studies for inflammatory pathways, oxidative stress, blood sugar regulation, gut barrier support, and cellular repair. Not miracle cures, not replacements for medicine, but foods the ancient world handled with a seriousness we have mostly lost. Pay close attention to number 1. It is so ordinary that most people treat it as sweetness, not medicine. Proverbs says it is good. The land itself was described by it. And modern science is beginning to explain why the raw, unheated version is chemically different from the bottle most people squeeze into tea. And stay with us for number 7, because number 7 is the food Scripture uses to describe abundance, priestly beauty, and the evidence of the promised land itself. The part most people throw away contains more of the compounds researchers are studying than the part most people drink. That pattern is going to repeat. The medicine is often not in the part we market. It is in the part we forgot. Number 15. Wheat. The grain that only helps when it is still whole. In Deuteronomy 8:8, wheat is named first. That order matters. Wheat was not a side food in the biblical world. It was structure, bread, offering daily strength. The grain harvest shaped the calendar, the temple offerings, the labor of families, and the rhythm of survival. When Scripture speaks of wheat, it is speaking of the food that held ordinary life together. But here is the part modern people almost never hear. Biblical wheat and modern white flour are not the same food in the body. Ancient wheat was ground closer to the time it was eaten. It retained bran, germ, minerals, fiber, and plant compounds that are stripped away when flour is refined for softness and shelf life. The white flour that fills most modern bread is the inner starch of the grain, separated from the protective outer layers where much of the biological activity lives. That outer layer matters. Wheat bran contains arabinoxylans, a class of fermentable fibers that researchers study for their effect on the gut microbiome. When those fibers reach the colon, bacteria break them down into short-chain fatty acids, especially butyrate. Butyrate is not a wellness slogan. It is fuel for the cells lining the colon. It helps maintain the gut barrier, and the gut barrier is one of the places inflammation either quiets down or begins to spread. Here is the detail that changes the food. Bread made quickly from refined flour behaves very differently from bread made slowly from whole grain. Long fermentation breaks down some compounds, increases mineral availability, and changes how the body responds to the grain. The ancient world did not know the phrase glycemic response, but it knew slow dough, it knew sourness, it knew grain soaked, rested, and baked close to the source. To use wheat in a way closer to its older form, choose whole grain, stone ground, or long fermented bread, where wheat is not disguised as refined flour, with color added back. The bread should be dense, slightly sour, and substantial enough that one slice feels like food, not air. The first food named in the Promised Land was not refined into weakness. It was eaten with its structure intact. Number 14. Barley, the poor man's grain, with a powerful inflammatory lesson. When Jesus fed the 5,000, the loaves were barley loaves. That is not a random agricultural note. Barley was the grain of laborers, shepherds, soldiers, and people who needed endurance more than status. Wheat carried prestige. Barley carried bodies through long days. The ancient world may not have known why barley felt steady. Modern nutrition has a name for one major reason: beta-glucan. Beta-glucan is a soluble fiber that forms a thick gel in the digestive tract. That gel slows the movement of food, moderates glucose absorption, and helps bind bile acids, which is one reason barley has been studied for cholesterol support. But the deeper inflammatory connection is in the gut. Soluble fibers feed beneficial bacteria. Those bacteria produce metabolites that communicate with immune cells. The gut is not separate from inflammation. It is one of inflammation's main command centers. Here is what most people miss. Barley water, one of the oldest recovery drinks in the Mediterranean world, carries some of that soluble fiber into the liquid. When barley is simmered slowly, the water becomes cloudy and slightly viscous. That texture is not a flaw. That is the grain releasing what makes it useful. Modern people often strain things until they look clean. Ancient people watched what happened to the body. To prepare it traditionally, simmer 1 cup of whole barley in 6 cups of water for about an hour. The liquid should turn pale gold and slightly thick. Strain if you want the drink. Keep the grain for food, and add lemon only after cooking. Do not turn it into sugar water. The power is in the grain, not the sweetener. Barley teaches a quiet lesson. The food of the poor was not poor food. It was a slow medicine disguised as survival. Number 13. Grapes, the vine that carries more than sweetness. In Numbers 13:23, the spies returned from the valley of Eshcol carrying a cluster of grapes so large it had to be carried on a pole between 2 men. Scripture could have said the land was fertile. Instead, it showed us grapes heavy, visible, abundant, a fruit so full that the land itself seemed to be speaking through it. Grapes were never merely dessert in the biblical world. They were eaten fresh, dried into raisins, pressed into juice, fermented into wine, and stored as a source of energy through seasons when fresh food was scarce. The vine was agriculture, medicine, celebration, and covenant imagery all at once. The compounds that make grapes interesting today are concentrated especially in the skins and seeds of dark grapes. Resveratrol is the famous one, but it is not alone. Quercetin, anthocyanins, catechins, and dozens of other polyphenols work together in ways that researchers are still mapping. The mistake is thinking one isolated compound explains the whole fruit. It rarely does. Studies on grape polyphenols have explored effects on oxidative stress, endothelial function, inflammatory signaling, and blood vessel health. The evidence is still mixed in places, especially when isolated resveratrol is used at supplement doses. But whole grape preparations keep drawing attention because the compounds arrive together, not alone. Here is what most people never consider. Clear grape juice and dark grape juice are different foods. Seedless pale grapes and small dark grapes with thick skins are different foods. A grape eaten whole with skin, pulp, and seed fragments is different from a sweet drink filtered for smoothness. Ancient pressing was not sterile and industrial. Skins stayed in contact. Seeds broke. Color deepened. Bitterness remained. And that bitterness is often where the plant's defensive compounds are hiding. If you use grapes for this purpose, choose dark grapes with skins intact. Eat them whole or press them gently and drink fresh before heat and storage flatten the chemistry. The taste should be sweet, yes, but also slightly tannic, slightly gripping, like the fruit, still has something to say. The cluster from Eshkol was not carried back because it was convenient. It was carried back because abundance had weight. Number 12. Figs. The fruit of healing and reckoning. The fig tree appears in Scripture with unusual emotional range. It can represent peace, as when each man sits under his vine and fig tree. It can represent healing, as when Isaiah instructs that a cake of figs be applied to Hezekiah's boil. And it can represent judgment, as when a tree full of leaves but empty of fruit becomes a living warning. That range is not accidental. The fig is a food that asks whether appearance and substance still match. Modern research has identified several reasons figs mattered beyond sweetness. Fresh figs contain physin, a proteolytic enzyme that helps break down proteins. The latex of the fig tree has been used traditionally on skin growths and wounds. The fruit contains fiber, minerals, polyphenols, and compounds studied for antioxidant and anti-inflammatory behavior. But here is the preparation detail almost everyone misses. Fresh figs and dried figs are not the same medicine. Drying concentrates sugar and minerals and preserves fiber, but much of the enzyme activity associated with fresh fig is reduced or lost. A dried fig is still valuable. It is not identical. When Isaiah instructed a fig poultice for Hezekiah, the text describes an external preparation, a cake of figs placed on a lesion. That does not sound like modern nutrition advice, because it is not modern nutrition advice. It is older, more practical, more direct. A food becoming an application. For internal use, fresh figs are best eaten at room temperature, not cooked down into jam. 2 or 3 after a protein-heavy meal gives fiber, natural sweetness, and some enzyme activity if the fruit is truly fresh. Dried figs can be soaked overnight to soften them and make them gentler on digestion. Here is the hidden lesson. A fig tree can look alive and still fail at its purpose. Leaves are not fruit. Labels are not nourishment. A food can appear healthy and still have the useful parts processed away. The fig has always asked for evidence. Number 11. Lentils. The red stew that shows how inflammation begins in hunger. In Genesis 25, Esau comes in from the field exhausted and asks Jacob for the red stew. The text does not need a nutrition lecture. It gives us a man driven by depletion. He is hungry enough to trade away what should not have been traded. That is what bodily desperation does. It narrows the future down to the next mouthful. The stew was almost certainly lentil-based, the red-brown food of ordinary households across the ancient Near East. Lentils were cheap, durable, portable, and dense with nourishment. In a world without refrigerators or reliable meat, they were one of the foods that kept people alive. Modern science gives lentils a language the ancient world did not have. They contain resistant starch, soluble and insoluble fiber, polyphenols, magnesium, folate, and plant protein. Their effect on inflammation is not dramatic like a drug. It is structural. They feed the gut, they slow blood sugar, they reduce the metabolic spikes that keep the immune system irritated. Here is what most people misunderstand about anti-inflammatory eating. It is not only about adding heroic compounds, it is also about removing chaos. A meal that steadies glucose, feeds bacteria, and keeps hunger from turning into panic is already doing anti-inflammatory work. The preparation matters. Lentils soaked, rinsed, simmered with cumin, coriander, onion, garlic, and olive oil become very different from lentils boiled hard into a bland paste and eaten reluctantly. Spices were not decorative in the ancient world. They made legumes digestible. They turned survival food into medicine. To prepare them well, rinse red lentils until the water runs mostly clear. Simmer gently with onion, Garlic added late, cumin, coriander, and olive oil stirred in after heat. The stew should be soft but not dead. Warm, earthy, red, gold, and steadying. Esau's story is usually taught as a moral failure. It is also a physiological warning. A body left empty long enough will start negotiating with the soul. Number 10. Bitter herbs. The Passover food that taught the body to remember. At Passover, Israel was commanded to eat the lamb with unleavened bread and bitter herbs. The bitterness was not garnish. It was memory placed directly on the tongue. The body was required to taste what bondage had been. That is a profound idea. Scripture did not leave memory in the mind alone. It put memory in food. The exact bitter herbs used across history varied by region, but the category includes plants like chicory, endive, wild lettuce, horseradish, and other sharp greens. Many bitter plants contain compounds that stimulate saliva, bile flow, and digestive secretions. They wake the digestive system before heavier food arrives. Modern people often remove bitterness from the diet. We breed it out, sweeten around it, cover it with sauces. But bitterness is one of the body's oldest signals that a plant contains defensive chemistry. Not every bitter compound is useful, and not every bitter plant is safe. But the broad pattern matters. Many edible bitter greens contain polyphenols, glucosinolates, sesquiterpene lactones, and other compounds studied for inflammatory and metabolic effects. Here is the part everyone misses. Bitter herbs were eaten at a meal built around liberation. That means the taste of discomfort was not avoided. It was integrated. The bitter was not the enemy of the feast. It was part of the feast's truth. To use this principle, add a small bitter green before or with a meal, arugula, chicory, endive, dandelion greens if safely sourced, or a small amount of horseradish. Do not drown it. Let the bitterness register. Add olive oil and a little vinegar. The sharpness should wake the mouth. Inflammation often grows where the body has been forced to carry what the mind refuses to feel. Bitter herbs remind us that healing does not always begin sweet. Number 9. Garlic. The food Israel remembered when the wilderness got hard. In Numbers 11-5, the Israelites complain in the wilderness and remember the foods of Egypt, fish, cucumbers, melons, leeks, onions, and garlic. It is easy to read that moment only as ingratitude, but look at what they remember. Not luxury, not gold, not palaces. Foods that made the body feel strong. Garlic sits in that list like a small burning coal. Across ancient Egypt, Greece, India, China, and the Mediterranean world, garlic was used for endurance, infection resistance, circulation, and food preservation. That kind of convergence across unconnected civilizations is not proof by itself, but it is a pattern worth respecting. The central compound everyone talks about is allicin, but allicin is not sitting ready-made inside the clove. It forms when garlic is crushed or chopped and the enzyme allinase meets alliin. Damage the clove and the chemistry begins. Leave the clove whole, and much of that reaction never happens. Here is the part most kitchens get wrong. If garlic is crushed and thrown immediately into high heat, the enzyme is damaged before the reaction finishes. The ancient habit of pounding garlic in a mortar and letting it sit before mixing it into food may have preserved more activity than many modern cooking methods. Garlic's sulfur compounds have been studied for antimicrobial effects, vascular function, immune modulation, and inflammatory signaling. The research is complex, and not every claim survives scrutiny, but the preparation principle is clear enough to use. Crush 1 or 2 cloves. Let them rest for 10 minutes. Add them late in cooking or mix with olive oil, lemon, and herbs for a raw sauce. The smell should be alive, sharp, almost too honest. The Israelites remembered garlic when their bodies were strained. That tells us something. Some foods are not glamorous because they were never designed for glamour. They were designed to keep ordinary people from falling apart. Number 8. Olive oil, the oil that must still taste alive. Olive oil appears everywhere in Scripture. It anoints kings. It lights lamps. It is poured into wounds by the Good Samaritan. It marks abundance, consecration, hospitality, and care. The olive tree was not background scenery in the biblical world. It was infrastructure. Modern research has given one of olive oil's most interesting compounds a name, oleocanthal. It is associated with the peppery burn at the back of the throat in high-quality extra virgin olive oil. Researchers have studied it because it interacts with inflammatory pathways, including enzymes, also targeted by common anti-inflammatory drugs. But here is where most people are deceived. The words olive oil on a bottle do not guarantee the food Scripture knew. Refined olive oil, old olive oil stored in clear glass under light, oil blended and softened until bitterness disappears. All of these can carry far less of the polyphenol profile that makes extra virgin olive oil so interesting. The burn is not a defect. The bitterness is not a problem. Those are clues. Ancient oil was pressed, used, smelled, tasted, and judged by the senses. It was not expected to sit for 2 years under fluorescent light and remain unchanged. Oil is not a symbol of life because it is inert. It is a symbol of life because it changes. For anti-inflammatory use, look for extra virgin olive oil with a harvest date, dark glass, and a peppery finish. Use it raw over finished food more often than as a high-heat cooking fat. Drizzle it over lentils, bitter greens, barley, figs with herbs, or whole grain bread. The taste should catch the throat slightly. When the Samaritan poured oil on the wounded man, he was not performing decoration. He was applying one of the most trusted substances his world carried on the road. Number 7. Pomegranate. The fruit whose discarded part may be the strongest. The pomegranate appears at the edge of the sacred. It was embroidered on the hem of the high priest's robe. It crowned the pillars of Solomon's temple in carved form. And when the spies returned from Canaan, pomegranates came back with grapes and figs as proof that the land was good. That is not accidental placement. The pomegranate is one of the most chemically dense fruits in the biblical diet. Its signature compounds include punicolagens, elagitannins that break down into metabolites called urolithins through the work of gut bacteria. Researchers study these pathways for oxidative stress, inflammation, vascular function, and cellular maintenance. But here is the part most people never hear. The juice is not the whole story. The peel, the leathery bitter rind that most people throw away without a thought, contains some of the highest concentrations of punicolagens in the entire fruit. Traditional Persian, Ayurvedic, and North African preparations use the rind for gut complaints and inflammation long before anyone named the molecules. We drink the sweet red part and discard the bitter protective part. That is almost a perfect picture of modern nutrition. The arils contain juice and seeds. The seeds contain their own fatty acids, including punicic acid. The peel contains tannins. The white membrane carries bitterness. Each part is different. The whole fruit is not one compound. It is a system. To use pomegranate more completely, eat the arils whole rather than only drinking strained juice. If using the rind, use only clean, unsprayed fruit. Dry small pieces at low heat and steep a tiny amount in warm water. The taste is astringent, reddish-brown, and not especially pleasant. That is often how concentrated plant defenses announce themselves. The pomegranate was sewn into the priestly garment where movement made it visible. The lesson is quiet but exact. What hangs at the edge may carry more meaning than what sits at the center. Number 6. Fish. The food of ordinary disciples and inflamed bodies. Fish appears repeatedly in the New Testament, not as luxury, but as daily food. Fishermen become disciples. Nets break with abundance. A resurrected Jesus eats broiled fish by the sea. The miracle of loaves and fish is not built from rare ingredients. It is built from what ordinary people had. The biblical world around Galilee knew fish as protein, livelihood, trade, and survival. Dried fish, salted fish, small, whole fish, and fresh catches all mattered. And from a modern inflammatory perspective, fish carries one of the most studied nutrient families in nutrition, omega-3 fatty acids. EPA and DHA, found especially in fatty fish, are involved in the production of specialized pro-resolving mediators. That phrase matters. Inflammation is not simply something to suppress. It is a process the body must resolve. A healthy inflammatory response begins, does its work, and then turns itself off. Omega-3 fats are part of the chemistry associated with that turning off process. Here is the detail many people miss. Not all fish meals carry the same effect. Deep-fried fish in damaged oil is not the same as broiled or gently cooked fish. Lean white fish is not the same as fatty fish. Fresh, small fish, eaten close to source, is not the same as heavily processed fish products held together with starch and preservatives. The ancient preparation was simple because it had to be fire, salt, herbs, oil, sometimes drying, sometimes broiling over coals. Very little stood between the fish and the person eating it. To use the principle well, choose sardines, mackerel, trout, anchovies, or other fatty fish when available. Prepare gently. Add olive oil after cooking, bitter herbs beside it, and whole grain bread if you want the meal to feel ancient in the best sense. The plate should be plain enough that the food is still recognizable. The disciples were not called from abstraction. They were called from nets, boats, hunger, breakfast fires, and the smell of fish cooking near water. The body was always part of the story. Number 5. Almonds, the watchful nut that appears when authority is confirmed. In Numbers 17, Aaron's rod buds, blossoms, and produces almonds. The image is almost impossible to forget. Dead wood bearing life overnight. Authority confirmed not by argument, but by fruit. Almonds also appear among the best products Jacob sends to Egypt in Genesis 43, alongside balm, honey, spices, myrrh, pistachios, and almonds. These were not scraps. They were valuable foods, chosen for a tense, diplomatic moment. Nutritionally, almonds bring monounsaturated fats, magnesium, vitamin E, fiber, and polyphenols concentrated, especially in the brown skin. Their connection to inflammation is not one dramatic compound, but a pattern. Improved lipid profiles in some studies, better post-meal glucose control when eaten with carbohydrate, antioxidant support from vitamin E, and gut effects from fiber and polyphenols. Here is the part most people remove. The skin. Blanched almonds look clean and taste mild, but the skin contains a meaningful portion of the polyphenols. Ancient people did not usually peel almonds into cosmetic whiteness. They cracked, soaked, roasted, ground, and ate them much closer to whole. There is also a preparation lesson. Almonds eaten alone can be useful. Almonds paired with dates, figs, or whole grains change the meal. Their fat and protein slow the absorption of sugars. The ancient world often paired fast energy with slower fuel because the body feels the difference even without a glucose monitor. For a simple preparation, soak raw almonds overnight, drain, and eat with dates or figs, or grind them into a rough paste with a little olive oil and herbs. Keep the skins unless there is a specific reason not to. The taste should be nutty, slightly tannic, and substantial. Aaron's rod did not produce candy, it produced almonds, a food with a hard shell, a protective skin, and nourishment hidden inside. Scripture knew how to choose an image. Number 4. Milk and curds. The ancient comfort food with a living question. The Promised Land is repeatedly described as flowing with milk and honey. In Genesis 18, Abraham serves curds and milk to his visitors. In Judges 5, Jael gives Sisera milk and curds. These foods were part of the hospitality and survival economy of pastoral life. But the milk of the ancient world was not the industrial product most people know now. It was fresh, local, often fermented quickly because there was no refrigeration. Curds, yogurt-like preparations, sour milk, and cultured dairy were not specialty foods. They were what milk naturally became when handled by people who understood time, temperature, and microbes by observation. The inflammatory question around dairy is complicated. Some people tolerate it well, some do not. That honesty matters. But fermented dairy has a different biological profile from sweetened, flavored, ultra-processed dairy products. Fermentation introduces bacteria, changes lactose content, produces organic acids, and can create peptides that researchers study for metabolic and immune effects. Here is what most people miss. The biblical phrase milk and honey may not point only to sweetness and abundance. It points to a food system: animals, pasture, bees, flowers, seasons, fermentation, and careful handling. Milk was alive, in a way shelf-stable products are not. To use this principle, choose plain fermented dairy if you tolerate dairy, unsweetened yogurt, kefir, labna, or cultured curds. Add raw honey only after fermentation and never to boiling liquid. Add figs, pomegranate, or almonds. Avoid turning it into dessert disguised as health food. The taste should be tangy, creamy, faintly sour. That sourness is not failure. It is evidence that microbes have done work. The ancient table did not separate nourishment from living processes. Milk became curds because life was moving through it. Number 3. Cucumbers and melons. The wilderness craving that was really about hydration. In Numbers 11-5, the Israelites remember cucumbers and melons from Egypt. These are easy foods to dismiss. They do not sound medicinal. They sound like refreshment. But in a desert body, refreshment is not trivial. Cucumbers and melons are water held in plant form. They carry fluid, potassium, small amounts of minerals, and plant compounds in a package that can be eaten when the body is hot, depleted, and salt-worn. In the ancient Near East, foods like these were not diet snacks. They were hydration strategies. Inflammation rises when the body is under stress, heat stress, dehydration, poor sleep, infection, blood, sugar swings. A body that lacks water and electrolytes becomes less resilient. The foods Israel remembered were not random cravings. They were the foods of bodily relief. Here is the detail that matters. Cucumbers and melons are most useful when they replace inflammatory patterns, not when they are added to them. A bowl of salted cucumber with herbs before a meal changes the meal. Melon eaten in season, whole and fresh, is different from melon flavoring in a sweet drink. Cucumber skin contains more fiber and certain phytochemicals than the watery center. Melon seeds, eaten in some traditional cultures, contain fats and minerals that are usually discarded. Again, the pattern returns. The part we throw away is often not useless. A simple ancient-style preparation is cucumber sliced with salt, vinegar, dill or mint, and olive oil. Let it sit until the juices collect at the bottom of the bowl. That liquid, sharp and green, is part of the food. For melon, eat it fresh, in season, and not as a syrup. The Israelites remembered cucumbers and melons because the body remembers relief. Sometimes, the anti-inflammatory food is not the one with the loudest compound. Sometimes it is the one that lowers the body's burden. Number 2. Vinegar. The sour drink of laborers and soldiers. Vinegar appears in Scripture in humble places. Ruth dips bread into vinegar while gleaning in the field. At the crucifixion, sour wine is lifted to Jesus. This was not fine wine. It was the acidic drink of workers, soldiers, and people who needed refreshment that would keep. Ancient vinegar was often diluted with water. It was sharp, cheap, antimicrobial compared to unsafe water, and useful in heat. The Romans called a version of it Pascha. The poor and the practical knew it well. Modern research on vinegar focuses largely on acetic acid and its effects on post-meal glucose response, gastric emptying, and metabolic markers. The evidence is not a license to drink vinegar carelessly. Undiluted vinegar can harm teeth and irritate the throat, but used properly, acid before or with a meal can change how that meal lands in the body. And that matters for inflammation because repeated glucose spikes are not neutral. They contribute to oxidative stress and inflammatory signaling over time. A sour preparation that moderates the meal may be small, but small daily things become large in the body. Here is what most people miss. Vinegar in the ancient world was not wellness punishment. It was food. Bread dipped in vinegar. Herbs dressed with vinegar. Lentils brightened with vinegar. Cucumbers preserved with vinegar. It belonged inside meals, not outside them as a stunt. To use it carefully, add 1 or 2 teaspoons of real vinegar to a glass of water and drink with food. Or better, use it in dressing over bitter greens, cucumbers, lentils, or barley. The mouth should register sourness, not pain. Ruth's bread dipped in vinegar is a quiet scene. A working woman in a field, receiving enough sharpness and bread to keep going. Not glamorous, not branded. Useful. Number 1. Honey. The sweetness that only works when it has not been ruined. A land flowing with milk and honey. The phrase appears again and again until it becomes almost too familiar. That familiarity is dangerous. We stop hearing it. We imagine sweetness, comfort, abundance. All true. But honey in the ancient world was also preservation, wound care, energy, antimicrobial protection, and a food that could last when almost nothing else did. Proverbs 24:13 says, "Eat honey because it is good." The line is simple, almost too simple, but simplicity is not shallowness. Raw honey is chemically alive in ways heavily heated. Honey is not. It contains enzymes, organic acids, polyphenols, bee-derived proteins, and a low-water activity that makes it hostile to many microbes. When diluted, certain honeys can generate hydrogen peroxide through enzymatic activity. Some honeys contain additional antimicrobial compounds depending on floral source. But here is the betrayal hidden in the modern bottle. Honey is often heated for clarity, filtered for beauty, blended for uniformity, and sometimes adulterated in ways the average buyer cannot see. It still tastes sweet. It still pours, but sweetness is not the same as activity. The ancient world prized honey not because it was candy, but because it was rare concentrated life, gathered from flowers by bees and preserved without refrigeration. Date honey may also be included in the biblical language of the land, and that matters too because both bee honey and date syrup point to the same idea. Sweetness drawn from living landscapes, not refined in factories. For daily use, choose raw, unfiltered honey from a trustworthy source. It may be cloudy. It may crystallize. That is not a defect. Stir 1 teaspoon into warm, not boiling water, or add it to plain curds, figs, barley porridge, or bitter herbs after heat has passed. If the liquid is hot enough to burn your tongue, it is too hot for raw honey. Honey closes this list because it reveals the whole pattern. The difference between medicine and imitation is often handling. Raw honey and overheated honey are not the same. Whole barley and polished starch are not the same. Bitter pomegranate peel and sweetened red juice are not the same. Extra virgin olive oil with a peppery burn and refined oil with no memory left in it are not the same. Crushed garlic rested for 10 minutes and jarred garlic paste are not the same. Whole wheat slowly fermented and white flour inflated into softness are not the same. The ancient world did not have our vocabulary. It did not speak of cytokines, oxidative stress, gut permeability, endothelial function, beta-glucan, oleocanthal, punicolagens, arabinoxylans, or specialized pro-resolving mediators. But it had something we have become surprisingly poor at practicing: attention. It watched what happened when grain was fermented slowly. It watched what happened when oil was fresh and bitter. It watched what happened when garlic was crushed, when barley water was cloudy, when bitter herbs prepared the stomach, when honey was kept raw, when pomegranate rind was not thrown away, when fish was cooked simply, when lentils were spiced instead of merely boiled. That is not superstition. That is observation repeated across generations. There is also a warning here. Inflammation is not only a medical category, it is a signal that the body has been carrying too much for too long. Too much refined food, too much speed, too much heat applied to delicate things, too much sweetness separated from its source, too many labels standing in for nourishment. The promised land was described through foods because food is how abundance becomes physical. Wheat, barley, vines, figs, pomegranates, olive oil, honey. A list so simple that a child can memorize it, and so layered that modern research is still working through the mechanisms. The question is not whether ancient people knew everything. They did not. The question is whether they paid attention to things we stopped noticing. What if the anti-inflammatory diet Scripture points toward is not a trend at all, but a pattern of wholeness, foods close to source, prepared with patience, bitter when bitterness belongs, sweet only when sweetness is still alive, oils that still burn, grains that still carry their fiber, fruits eaten with their skins, seeds, rinds, and seasons respected, used whole, prepared carefully, understood more deeply. That may be the part doctors do not always have time to tell you. Not because every doctor is hiding it, but because a medical system built around crisis rarely has room to teach the discipline of daily preparation. And preparation is where the ancient world kept much of the medicine. If this added something to your understanding, share it with someone who is trying to rebuild their health from the table upward. Like and subscribe if you want to keep exploring the place where Scripture, history, and modern research meet. And tell us in the comments which biblical food surprised you most. Which one have you been using wrong, and which one are you going to bring back to your table first?